Join me in the audio garden to cultivate our collective wisdom, nurture creativity, and spread love. My name is Martha Cinader. Welcome to Listen and Be Heard. There are so many more sounds in spring, and I have been listening and working alongside my friends in the garden, the woods, the treetops. And today, during this hour for writers and readers, we're going to go back to Berkeley, California in the 1970s. And our guide in the audio garden is Joan Gelfand, author of Outside Voices, a memoir of the Berkeley Revolution. And since rain is predicted for a little later, I'm going to dig around in the archives for an interview I did with brain surgeon and author Leonard Shlain back in 1999, who will take us on a journey through ancient history and our own minds. And they both have a lot to say, so let's just go join Joan Gelfand now and listen to her read first from Outside Voices.
This chapter is actually called the Berkeley Revolution, and it takes place where I'm living with a women's band, and it's a very political women's band. So it goes like this. In the falling down house, the Berkeley Women's Music Collective gets serious. The band's popularity is growing. They are being invited to gigs around the country, and I have been asked to recite my poetry to their music. We are developing strong outside voices for singing and reciting poetry, using them to speak out against injustice. At Derby Street, our women friends are making films, having art exhibits, and designing feminist theory. We become thinkers, teachers, philosophers, and activists, and we are voluble and everywhere. We are the Berkeley Revolution. The moment is about doing whatever it takes to expand women's rights and all human rights. Chains are broken, conventions tossed. We don't just want changes in a women's right to choose, the ERA, and an end to discrimination. We want an end to capitalism. We want all the rights to our bodies, and we want to make sure every child is fed, whether Black, white, Latino, Native American, Asian. We want to smash the glass ceiling, and we want our voices heard loud.
You've been listening to Joan Gelfand, reading from Outside Voices, a memoir of the Berkeley Revolution. Author of 3 volumes of poetry and an award-winning chapbook of short fiction, Joan Gelfand was a finalist in the International Book Awards for her novel Extreme. You Can Be a Winning Writer, the 4 C's system to author success, craft, commitment, community, and confidence, is an Amazon #1 bestseller. The Ferlinghetti School of Poetics, a film based on Joan's poem about Lawrence Ferlinghetti, was featured in over 20 international film festivals and won several awards. A beloved teacher and mentor, Joan is President Emeritus of the Women's National Book Association and a member of the National Book Critics Circle. Joan holds a BA from San Francisco State University and an MFA in creative writing from Mills College. Her work appears in over 150 lit magazines, journals, and magazines, including Huffington Post, LA Review of Books, the San Francisco Chronicle, and Le Ver littéraire. For more information about her work, visit joangelfand.com. And Joan lives in San Francisco with her husband, Adam Hertz. My name is Martha Cinader, and we're here in the audio garden to talk about an era and a place where women were tending a women's garden. I want to welcome my special guest, Joan Gelfand, to our audio garden, our hour for readers and writers especially. And I'm so happy to have you here to talk about your new book, Outside Voices. And I have to say, among other things that it's all about, it seems to also be a love letter to Berkeley, California. Your descriptions of Berkeley are so admiring, and I think you having come from New York City to going to Berkeley, you were constantly drawing a contrast between the two.
Yeah, I mean, to move from a neighborhood and a city that was so concrete and kind of close, everything kind of close, to going to Berkeley with these expansive views and green hills and hiking trails. It was just heavenly.
Your book is a memoir, and it's called Outside Voices, the subtitle, A Memoir of the Berkeley Revolution. And you're talking about your time in the 60s and 70s. And you describe later on a situation after you arrive in Berkeley, after the death of your father, where you attend an activist demonstration and you come away feeling like, well, this was not for me. This is not as important to me, listening to men who actually might have been aligned with your political views, but nevertheless, they were men voicing their opinions, and you felt much more strongly a need to express what women needed.
It actually is about a very specific time in history, 1972 to 1975. So I wasn't there in the 60s.
I apologize.
No. Historically, it's important because the second wave feminism came on the heels of the free speech movement and the Summer of Love and the Beats and all these worldwide movements that started in and around Berkeley. Now it was still going on, but I was enmeshed with second wave feminism, which was we were fighting for women's rights, and that was my focus.
And can you clarify for listeners what second wave as opposed to first wave feminism is?
Yes, thank you. Well, the first wave of feminism was when the suffragists marched and finally got women the right to vote. And that was around the 20s, 1920. It's hard to believe that women could not vote in this country.
Couldn't have bank accounts, couldn't have titles to houses.
Right, couldn't buy houses, didn't have credit. So second wave feminism was a celebration first of the 50 years, marking 50 years of voting rights. But then we said, not we, people like Gloria Steinem, Bella Abzug, Betty Friedan, the people who were on the front line, said, now it's time to move women forward. We want 24/7 childcare, abortion and reproductive rights nationwide, and we want equal pay for equal work. Well, as you know, we did get abortion legalized nationwide in the early 70s. We never did get childcare paid for, and we are working on equal pay for equal work. I mean, you haven't asked me what's happening now, but I'll just put in my 2 cents for a moment, which is what's happening now is inspiring younger women to become active. So that's good, especially because their reproductive rights are on the line.
One thing that struck me, though, in all of this is that you are very philosophical and keep returning to the question of anger and violence as a way to affect change. And this is something that I think you show a lot of concern with in this book. And I wanted to read a passage that I found to be very poignant. It's very short. Let's see. For every one of the angry artists and political activists I hear, for all the outside voices I encounter, I consider my mother's private, quiet suffering, her survival plan of self-medicating with television, tranquilizers, and cigarettes. Simply putting one foot in front of the other, she brought home enough of a paycheck to cover rent and food. For the life of me, I can't see how being angry would have helped. To me, that's just gets to the heart of a lot of things. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about anger and political activism.
You know, that's a very interesting question. People don't realize this, but I've heard people who started the Black Panther movement speak in the last 5-10 years, because I've always been very interested in that movement, because second wave feminism also combined and collaborated and cooperated with Black power and Black rights, and we were all kind of in it together. The Black Panthers picked up guns only not intentioning to be violent, but to show that they were serious. And I think this country is kind of on a little bit of a bad track, because we see violence as a way to get things done. I do not believe in violence. The women's movement that I was involved with was never violent. The most violent thing that happened, which is when I left, which is that the leaders in the feminist movement said, no men allowed. And that's when I departed, because I felt like that was a losing game.
And that is another theme you explore in the book.
I just didn't see the point of eliminating men from women's struggle to get rights, because we could have allies. We could make men our associates and our friends. And I just didn't see separating.
You know, you bring up this whole situation of, women could not vote. Women could not have a bank account. They were very dependent on men in a very real sense, as it continues to be true in many parts of the world. And so when you ask, well, would it have helped for her to be angry or defiant? And you seem to come to the conclusion of no. And I wonder what might have helped, or if nothing would have helped, or if you wish anything had been different, or how you perceive that in the next generation.
I think anger is a very complicated issue. I think sometimes anger can motivate and light a spark to get us moving and to get things accomplished. Do you know what I mean? And on the other hand, it can be destructive. I think if my mother had been less repressed and more in touch with her anger, maybe it would have gotten her to get what she wanted out of life, which she really never did. But what it did, observing her, was it lit the fire for me. I was very determined to have a life that I would end up with feeling like I had accomplished what I wanted to accomplish.
And you credit a lot of that ability to this sort of support that you felt that you got when you arrived in Berkeley and the whole scene that was happening there at the time. And it seems to me that it was incredibly important to have the support of other women. And you do explore a sort of fluid sexuality between, being attracted to that sisterhood.
Think back to the middle of the century. Women were programmed by, the culture to be competitive with each other, as beautiful as they could be. The beauty standards were ridiculous. Well, they still are, but I mean, they were really bad in the 50s. And so I grew up in a household that was not very supportive, woman to woman, meaning I didn't get love, encouragement, and support from my mother and sister. And when I arrived in Berkeley, I was like, oh my God, there are women who are actually supportive and encouraging of other women, that they actually want you to succeed. And that's, as I say in the book, that's where I found my voice. That's where I allowed myself to have a voice, because one of the first people I met in Berkeley was like, you're a poet? Type your poems. And I was like, type your poems. Okay, that sounds awfully serious. But of course, that was the first step.
Another theme that you return to in various ways in this book is your Jewish heritage. And I think it's tied up with the love and loss of your father, who went to temple and was a religious man. We have a similar trajectory. I'm a little younger than you, but I had, on my father's side, is Jewish, and I had a cousin who spent some time on a kibbutz in Israel. She's a little older than me. And I also moved from New York to the West Coast. And I just wondered about how you feel now when you examine your role as a Jew. You were obviously very open to all kinds of ideas, religions, philosophies, and yet you did stick to, or were constantly examining, I should say, maybe your Jewish identity. And I wonder now, in the current state of affairs, what you're still thinking about.
Well, I'm a good Californian because I'm a Jew boo, which means, of course, I've explored meditation. I am a meditator, and I'm also at peace with my Jewish identity. Many, many leaders in the Buddhist movement here are Jewish. Jack Kornfield, Sylvia Boorstein, my meditation teacher, Norman Fisher. I mean, all the leaders, many, many of the leaders out here are Jewish, but who are now, Buddhist. But I'm completely at peace at the path that I've chosen. I see the spiritual and emotional and even physical benefits of having a serious meditation practice, and at the same time, I'm very involved with my Jewish life, and I raised my kids Jewish, and my kids are all enjoying their Jewish life. So, it's all good now, but things tend to sort themselves out as you get older, right? When you're young, everything is very fraught. Oh my God, if I meditate, does that mean I'm Jewish? Like that. So there's a lot of drama. But what, I'm glad you brought up the kibbutz. What I did get very clear on, and what I talk about in the book, is that as a young, idealistic person, I thought going to Israel would be a wonderful lifestyle, because at my heart, I really believed in socialism. And the kibbutz was a socialist experiment. But when I got to Israel and I saw that the embedded racism from the European Jews, the ones who were in leadership, the German, Austrian, European Jews, against the darker Jews, I was so devastated, because to me that was such a beautiful opportunity to get rid of institutionalized racism, right? If you have a Moroccan Jew who's dark-skinned, that's a beautiful thing. No, there was racism and they were treated poorly.
And in fact, there were Palestinian Jews.
Right.
Why was it so important to you? Why did you want to write this memoir and focus it on this period of time in Berkeley?
The older I got, the more I understood that this was such a unique and particular period of history. And I did my research, and there was so little written about it. And then, because it was the 50-year anniversary, I think my publisher got excited, right? Because there's a lot being written. The 70s are having a big revival now because it's the 50-year anniversary.
When you say there wasn't much written about it, I think, there's been maybe a lot of writing about the culture in various ways of that time, but maybe not so much about that group of lesbian women at that time.
There was a lot that came out at that time because women were starting presses and newspapers. And so a lot was published in that time, but not a lot has been looked back at that time.
So why do you think that is? Do you think it's just too soon for that to have happened, or that it's just been overlooked, or it was just waiting for you to come and fill that gap?
Yeah. My first response may not be the right one, but I wonder if it's because it's about women, which, we're always getting the short end of the stick, so to speak, because look how much has been written about the anti-war movement and the free speech movement.
Exactly.
So it definitely does make me curious why this hasn't been covered as much.
And so what was your path to publication for this? You are a published poet, and I have not read your books of poetry, but you have 3 books of poetry. Why make this move, and how difficult was it to write this memoir as a different direction?
Honestly, it was the easiest thing I ever wrote. And I say that because poetry is such a particular art, and every single word on the page is up for grabs. Right. The memoir, everybody keeps saying, oh, to read a memoir written by a poet, the language is so poetic. So I think I had already kind of honed my writing craft so well. And, I didn't quite know where the story was going to go or end up. And I think that's a good thing. I tell people that from the table of contents that I pitched my publisher on to the table of contents in the final book, the book changed quite a bit. But I think all for the better.
And how difficult was it for you to find a publisher?
I had an agent who was pitching the book, and then it turned out that there was a connection to Post Hill Press, which is a division of Simon & Schuster. Post Hill was very interested in political books and interested in this particular topic.
Well, I found this book fascinating, and I want to thank you for writing it. And I'd like to give you an opportunity to maybe say something about it that I did not give you an opportunity to say, if there's something you would like to say to potential readers about your memoir.
Sure. I think the biggest takeaway from the book is how important community was and is for artists and writers. And I think now with social media, people think, well, if I'm on a Facebook group, I'm in community. But the truth is, and of course you are, you are, but it's also very important to be out there physically in the community. So people, just like what you're doing, so people know who you are, right? Online, we're just a dot, And when we go out in public, people get to know us as people.
Well, thank you for that. I've been speaking with Joan Gelfand, author of Outside Voices, a memoir of the Berkeley Revolution. readily available everywhere. And I want to thank you very much for your time. And if you could please also tell us if there is a place on social media where you would like to send people to find out more about you.
I'm on Facebook, I'm on Instagram, and I'm on LinkedIn, and pretty much all under Joan Gelfand. So I'm pretty easy to find.
Once it's heard, it can't be unheard. Once it's published, it's not going to be unpublished. Once you read the poem, you can't unread it. No matter how an individual may try to push it to the side, forget about it, it's still in there. And it's the words, the meaning, the feelings behind it are taking root in their psyche, and they can't get rid of it.
Hi, my name is James Cruel, here in Greenville, South Carolina. Concerning the books, I don't understand what's the meaning of taking the books away out of libraries. It's all history. You can't erase history. The book has already been written. If you take it out of the library, that don't mean that you can stop someone from getting knowledge about that book. So I don't see the purpose of taking it out of school. I think it's more political than anything. And I think it's sending a bad message to the kids, you know. And no matter what race they is, I think it's just you denying them a right to know about history. You know, I don't know where we get off pick and choosing what we want to be taught. I could see if it was something that's causing life or death. It's not. It's history. You can't erase that. Just because you had one person say something that they don't agree with, I don't think that should be for the whole society. If you take the book off the shelf, how can you teach it? You're really not going to stop them, because if they really want to know about that book, any author that's written a book, all they got to do is go online or research it, Google it. So you're not stopping it. I think it's a bad motivation to kids. I really do.
Thank you to James Cruel for your thoughts on banning books. Please go to listenandbeheard.net to find instructions on how your comments can be heard too. Thanks also to Joan Gelfand for visiting us here in the Audio Garden. My name is Martha Cinader, and I want to thank you too so much for joining me here in the Audio Garden during this hour for writers and readers. At the end of the hour, we'll hear a little from poet Latasha Diggs about writing poetry. But first, I have to go get my shovel and dig up an old interview that is still very thought-provoking. So please listen to these announcements and station ID, and I'll meet you over there.
It wasn't that long ago that most of us in this country were engaged in farming.
Tune in April 10th to the Listen and Be Heard Hour with your host, Martha Cinader, when she's joined once again by the author of the Ethical Meat Handbook, Meredith Lee, for another edition on regional climate and agricultural resilience.
It used to be that we fed ourselves action without fossil fuels,
right,
without chemicals, without processed foods.
Their conversation continues on alternatives to capitalism, and they focus on the idea of the common wheel, raised in Laura Legnick's book, Agricultural Resilience.
I'm not one of these folks who are saying go back.
Let's go back.
There are probably some really good ideas that we could bring forward and make it part of the solution to climate change.
That's all coming up on the Listen and Be Heard Hour for Readers and Writers, Wednesday, April 10th, 4 to 5 p.m. on WPVM.
This is Listen and Be Heard Radio, WLBH.org. Welcome to the Audio Garden. Let's cultivate our collective wisdom, nurture creativity, and spread love. Just like I thought, it's raining, and everyone is scattered, but I'm prepared, because I know it's right here somewhere. I'm still thinking about the seeds he planted in my brain during the conversation I had all the way back in 1999 with Dr. Leonard Shlain, when his book The Alphabet versus the Goddess had just come out. A brain surgeon, he had previously written Art and Physics, and later he wrote Sex, Time, and Power before passing away in 2009. He offered a unique perspective on herstory.
I used to do a fair amount of vascular surgery and operated on the carotid arteries to the brain, and have always been fascinated by the very different functions performed by the two hemispheres of the human brain. In addition to which, I'd written an earlier book, Art and Physics, and I treated those two subjects as if they were simply languages, art being the language of image and metaphor, and physics being the language of numbers and equations. And I proposed in that book that the artist had anticipated all the great ideas in physics prior to their explication and formulae. To write that book, I became very interested in communications theory and studied a lot of Marshall McLuhan. So with that information on hand, I went on an archaeological tour about 8 years ago to Mediterranean sites. And we had the good fortune to have this incredibly knowledgeable guide who informed our group at every shrine we stood before, whether it was Poseidon, Apollo, or Zeus, that originally this temple had been consecrated to a goddess, and then later unknown persons for unknown reasons reconsecrated it to a god. And this happened with such regularity that by the time we got to Ephesus, where the trip ended, I was struck by the overwhelming archaeological and historical evidence that both men and women in ancient civilizations worshipped goddesses. Women were priestesses of the religion, and property passed through the female mother's line. And then approximately 5,000 years ago, the goddess began to suffer a precipitous decline in power. And with the start of a Western culture, she just disappeared. And the three religions of the West, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, do not have a goddess. Women were banned from conducting any religious ceremonies, and property passed exclusively through the father's line. And I wanted to understand what happened. I mean, what event in culture could have been so immense and so pervasive as to literally change the sex of God?
Right. Now, it's interesting to me that this interest was sparked by your trip, by your travels. Now, I think at that time, were you aware of sort of the body of literature on the subject of, goddesses and how these things came about?
Well, somewhat. I mean, it wasn't...
I ask because I think your slant and direction on this has come from a very different direction, and perhaps it's part of what's refreshing about your point of view. I think a lot of women who have studied this have come from a very sort of passionate center, wondering, questioning about their place in society, why things are the way they are. And here you're sort of coming with this interest in the brain and how it functions. And yet you've written a book, Art and Physics, which is almost, you could say, talking about like a feminine language versus the more literate, scientific sort of way of thinking.
Yes.
And yet here you are, a successful doctor in Western culture, and perhaps we're not sort of, I don't want to say forced, but put in this position that a lot of women felt a real need to find some answers to these questions.
I had a chapter in Art and Physics that had the germ of this idea, and at the last minute I took it out because I decided that this was I just didn't want to just say it in a chapter. I needed to develop it. Mm-hmm. So it was kind of percolating in my head. I had read The Chalice and the Blade and a few other books. I proposed in the book, The Alphabet versus the Goddess, that it was an inside job. First, I should say that the most popular theory out there right now is the one put forth by Maria Gimbutas that proposes that the horse was domesticated in 4500 BC, and these rough horsemen came riding out of the north and conquered the goddess-loving people. But I had trouble with that because whenever an unsophisticated people conquer a sophisticated people, inevitably the values flow in the opposite direction. So that when the Romans conquered the Greeks within 100 years, they were all worshiping Greek gods and goddesses. When the barbarians conquered the Romans within a couple of 100 years, they were all Christians and wearing Roman insignia. So why wouldn't the Kurgan horsemen, who were nomads, who obviously saw the benefits of agriculture on the people that they conquered because they all became agriculturalists, why wouldn't they have worshipped the Earth Mother? So I think that the thug who mugged the goddess was none other than the invention of literacy, particularly alphabet literacy. You know, Sophocles once warned that nothing vast enters the life of mortals without a curse. And I think your listeners would agree that the invention of writing was vast. I mean, it was an enormous skill that enabled people to gain access to the most remarkable forms of information. But what was its downside? I mean, you know, if everything comes with that kind of a benefit, what was the price we paid for it? And Marshall McLuhan once said, the medium is the message, meaning that the method by which you perceive information is actually more important than the content of the information you perceive.
This idea that the medium is the message, you're basically proposing that we've moved into this electronic age and that part of it is this age of the image, and
Correct.
that people my age, people your age, have grown up watching television.
Correct.
And it's affected the way we think. And the last time you and I spoke, you said to me, you know, it doesn't matter what you're watching on television, your brain waves stay the same, basically. Right. And now we really have two tragic events that are happening sort of simultaneously in the world right now, one of which is this shooting in Colorado, and the other of which is all these bombs which are being dropped in Yugoslavia. And yet you claim that violence is somehow receding in the world, that this is somehow the dying throes.
Absolutely.
Now, when I watch some of the commentary on television, a lot of people are trying to blame the content of television, the movies, the fact that yet again these young children were watching the movie Natural Born Killers over and over again. And me as a content creator would like to also think that content has some sort of effect on people. And even you as a writer of a book, I think you would like to think that the contents of your book do affect people's brains in some sort of way. So could you sort of maybe try to explain that to us, or get me out of my dilemma in this, thinking of, it's almost like which came first, the chicken or the egg?
You know, we humans have something known as hemispheric lateralization, which means that we have a division between our hemispheres in their functions. All vertebrates from fish forward have a bilobe brain, but in a frog and a fish and other kinds of animals, each hemisphere essentially does what the other one does. It's just a mirror image of it. But in humans, we have this remarkable innovation called language. And nature decided in right-handed people to lay down approximately 90% of the tracks for deciphering and generating language in the left hemisphere. And while they were at it, I figured, well, let's put down all the linear sequential tracks for arithmetic, algebra, causality, determinism, logic, and reason in the left hemisphere. The right hemisphere retains the capacity to see the world all at once, see the parts to the whole, read a map, figure out how to get out of a maze, recognize a face. It's holistic, it's synthetic, it's simultaneous, and it's concrete. So human beings have two entirely different ways to perceive the world. One that's linear, abstract, and reductionist, and the other one is the right hemispheric holistic method. Each of these are complementary and they're both necessary. McLuhan's insight was that when you introduce into culture a form of communication that reinforces one hemisphere over the other, then what happens is you change culture. Writing and reading, I mean, as we're having this conversation right now, we're looking at each other. And as we're doing that, two things are happening. Your left hemisphere is listening to what I'm saying in a very linear, sequential fashion. But your right hemisphere is watching me. You're listening to the inflections of my voice. You want to see if I have alcohol in my breath or dandruff on my shoulders. You want to see if I'm sincere. If I was drumming my fingertips on the tabletop, your peripheral vision would pick that up. and that would go into the computational assessment of what's really going on in this conversation. In order for me to speak, even though my left hemisphere is generating these words, I need the cooperation of both sides of my lips, tongue, and vocal cords. If I've been to the dentist and I've had Novocaine, then I have trouble articulating speech, and we've all had that experience. So in order to speak and listen, there's an enormous amount of cross-traffic across the corpus callosum that connects the two hemispheres. But when you read and you write with only one hand. You can take your left hand and put it in your pocket while you're writing. Up until the invention of the typewriter for 5,000 years, the hand that held the writing implement, whether it was a man or a woman, it didn't make any difference, is the same hand that throws spears, swings swords, and pulls triggers. Now, you alluded to what's going on in the media today, and I think that, extensive research has shown that if you connect somebody's brain, or skull rather, to EEG leads and to measure their brain waves, and you give them a book to read, it doesn't matter what the content of the book is. It can be about sex and violence or travel logs or the business section. You generate beta waves, and beta waves are what you generate when you're concentrating on a task. When you ask that person to look up from a book and start watching television, it doesn't matter what the program is. It could be fake wrestling matches, cuddly koala bears, sex and violence. The beta waves go away and alpha and theta waves come up. Alpha and theta waves are what you generate when you meditate. If you connect somebody to a PET scanner, which measures blood flow to the brain, and you give them a book to read, again, the left hemisphere lights up and the right hemisphere is relatively dark regardless of the content. And then if you ask that person to start watching a basketball game or a sitcom or a weather report on television, the right hemisphere lights up and the left hemisphere goes dark. Now, in a culture that's watching approximately 5 hours of television a day, or at least the television sets are on that length, that's got to have an enormous impact in culture. Now, people say we live in a very violent society. I would dispute that. In the first 50 years of this century before television, the developed nations of the world engaged in 2 world wars and multiple genocides that resulted in the sadistic deaths of 70 million people. In the last 50 years of this century, the developed nations of the world have not engaged in fighting each other in wars, nor have they committed any mass genocides. We've had sporadic violence, and let us not forget that we now live in a country that has 265 million people in it. At a time 50 years ago, there was 130 million people, and we have about 262 million semi-automatic weapons. On any given day, somebody somewhere is going to pick one of those things up and start blowing away their neighbors or school friends or whatever.
So you're saying it's not that they were watching Natural Born Killers, but that when they left there was a gun laying there.
Yeah, I mean, you know, Germany in the 1930s was arguably one of the most literate, educated societies in the entire world. I mean, the students there, read Heine and could recite Mann and listen to Mozart. And, everyone went to Germany from America and England and France to see what their doctors and scientists and businessmen were doing. And yet the Germans followed this madman right off a cliff. And when it came time to making moral judgments, they were unable to make the proper moral judgments. So I'd always been taught that the key to civilizing the uncivilized is to educate them. So here we have this strange example. I realize there are many other factors involved, but it still doesn't explain the bizarre turn to darkness that went on in that culture. At the same time, you have in the United States an enormous number of black men that were lynched in the South, and you had homosexuals that were beaten to death, and it was never reported. You never heard about it. Matthew Shepard gets killed on a fence rail in Wyoming, and the next thing that happens is it's instant news. You see the parents burying him. You listen to the ministers eulogizing him. You see all the members of the city come out with a candlelight parade to proclaim that this is not the way we are, and the killers get the death sentence. Whether it's a black man being dragged behind a truck in Texas or a young homosexual man being murdered in Wyoming, we now have a different aspect. And yes, it shows us this violence, but it also shows us the effects of violence, which you never saw before. And can there be any doubt in anybody's mind that all these candlelight vigils and parades in Ireland and in all the cities whenever these violent acts take place are the result of people recoiling from and responding to the horror of this violence. So I would maintain that if you had your choice between living in the last 50 years of this century or the first 50 years of this century, one that was the first 50 not based on images and the second one all based on images, I would maintain you better pick the last 50 years. There's not a single recorded case of the followers of Ares marching down to the temple of Apollo and burning those people at the stake because they followed a different god. It didn't happen in Egypt or Mesopotamia. In China, you could be a Taoist, a Confucian, and a Buddhist simultaneously. There was no problem. So I wanted to understand if there was a time in the world when nobody killed each other over religion, and then they started, what happened. And the common denominator is an alphabetic sacred text, whether it's the Old Testament, the New Testament, or the Quran. There's something about the written word and the codification of the written word that deprives women of their rights and institutes a very harsh patriarchy and misogyny. And it's very interesting that if you think about it, Socrates, the Buddha, and Jesus never wrote anything down. I mean, they all lived at a time when literacy was the rage, and yet they all understood that when the message is oral, it's a different kind of message than when it gets written. You know, women were very taken with Jesus' oral message. It was about love and kindness and turn the other cheek, and the meek shall inherit the earth, and the last will be first.
And in fact, Merlin Stone argued quite convincingly when God Was a Woman that movement was really almost, you could call, a feminist movement of the time, or reemergence of the feminine.
Yes. And these women were head priests, and they baptized, and they founded churches, and they enjoyed these prerogatives until a signal event. And the signal event was the transcription of Jesus' words into a second alphabetic sacred text called the New Testament. And shortly thereafterwards, they lost all the rights. They were told they couldn't baptize anymore. They had to sit in the back of the church. They couldn't sing in the choir. And by the 4th and 5th century, the religion had been taken over by the patriarchs, who were a group of men who were writing long imageless tomes that changed the direction of Christianity to one that was about love and kindness and forgiving, to one that was increasingly about death, sin, guilt, and suffering. And then the most remarkable event happened. Rome collapsed, and with it, literacy got lost. So for the next 400 years, known as the Dark Ages, there was not a single king or nobleman in all of Europe that could read or write. I mean, it's an astonishing thing when you think about it. So you would think that during this period when there's no legal codes and constitutions and government bodies, that women's rights would have really suffered. So when the lights of history come on again in the 10th century, then what do we see? But there's all over Europe, there are men, troubadours, singing the praises of womanhood. There's a new military code called the Chivalric Code that states that the highest aspiration of a man is to honor women. Abbesses lead the monasteries in most of the major monasteries in Northern Europe. Women Christian mystics are revered by the church. And you have this remarkable occurrence of the people of medieval Europe expending great sums of time, energy, and money erecting these magnificent cathedrals dedicated to Notre Dame.
There was more to that conversation between myself, Martha Cinader, and author and brain surgeon Dr. Leonard Shlain, which you will be able to hear in its entirety at WLBH.org, where I am working, I promise, on bringing an actual schedule and Pacifica programming as well to our stream. That was the late Dr. Leonard Shlain back in 1999, talking about the alphabet versus the goddess. And next week, we will welcome Latasha Diggs to the Audio Garden, author of Village, a book of poems. The sun is already back out, and I would like to linger just a little and play for you some of Latasha's thoughts about writing poetry.
I listen to the composition. I listen for words beside other words. I listen for tensions within syntax and within order. It came down to like, okay, I am a poet. Do I like my work? And that was something that I said to myself a while ago. I don't think my stuff is growing. I don't think my stuff is improving. And I don't think the circle of folks that I want to be involved with, or have been involved with, are helping nurture that, right? None of us are really changing. So I need to do something about that. In some ways, I didn't have a choice. It was either like, okay, make a decision because you can't keep going on like this. The grief at that moment was on one wave. Other waves occurred during the years, which meant other things were discovered or needed to be dealt with, to be faced, to be confronted with. Things that were left unsaid. What does a building sound like during a pandemic when there's only 3 occupants in the building? That becomes part of the editing process. What does a building feel like or sound like when it's being demolished and you live right next door to the demolition? That becomes part of the editing process. What do gutted out apartments right next door to you look like? That then becomes a visual mapping, a visual template for how poems are formed, how poems are laid out and composed. And then also what happens with each of those apartments, right, is not only the demolishing or the gutting out of the actual materials, whether it's wire or brick or sheetrock or tile or wood. What's also being not demolished is the history of that apartment, is the memory associated with that apartment, is the memory of someone that you knew. We talk a lot about the G word. I'm not even going to say it, but you know what I'm talking about, the G word. And it's like, this is what the G word looks like. And also, this is what displacement looks like, right? But then this is also what the erasure of spatial memory looks like.
This is the Listen and Be Heard Hour for readers and writers. I'm Martha Cinader. I want to thank Davian Dial for introducing Listen and Be Heard to the broadcast airwaves at WPVM in Asheville, North Carolina. We are also heard on KCEI in Taos, New Mexico, and WLBH.org in Greenville, South Carolina, and around the world. Thank you to DJ Jeannie Hopper, my associate producer, J. Rodriguez Sierra, who provides background music and loops, and you can learn more about him at jrodriguezsierra.com. Jeremiah Cothran does editing for us. Yvette Murray is the voice in the banned books segment of our show. Tony Robles is my co-host and a contributor. Living It is produced by DJ Jeannie Hopper and Sabina Wertman. Released on Liquid Sound Lounge Records and the CD Living It. My name is Martha Cinader, and I want to thank you for listening and for the opportunity to be heard.
living it, giving it, having it, taking it, moving it, shaking it, creating it, loving it. Living it is loving it. Living it is sewing a coat, investing each stitch with magic, creating a unique design, putting it on and wearing it the rest of your life. Living it is knowing that what you see, what you hear is tangible. It's being a rock in the river and being the river too. It's hearing, you'll never be able to do that. Living it is knowing you will do it. It's speaking the unspoken. It's thinking the unthinkable. It's doing the unexpected. It's quitting before you get fired. Living it is giving it is having it is taking it is moving it, shaking it, creating it, loving it. Living it is loving it. Living it is loving a man you're not supposed to love. It's giving way to emotions, creating commotions, calling attention to yourself. And eye contact. Living it is learning from someone who can actually show you. It's cleaning your teacher's house or helping her to find one. It's never ever saying J-O-B. Living it is a one-way ticket and no solid plans. It's smoking a J in a smoke cafe in Amsterdam. It's saying the day is pretty in a strange new city. Living it is giving it is having it is taking it is moving it, shaking it, creating it, loving it. Living it is having nothing to lose and everything to gain. It's putting all of your charms and attributes, every single one of them, to good use. It's knowing the kindness of strangers and love for sale.